How many of you ever played when you were a kid the telephone game? And like you whisper to the next person and then they whisper to the next person. And sometimes the translation gets a little lost in translation over time. So in Chronicles we have the same events or same time period that we have in Kings and Second Kings. But we have a different perspective. So just like today, you turn on a news channel. Maybe you're watching CBS or you're watching Fox or you're watching NPR or listening to NPR or NBC or whatever. The perspective of the news team may be shaping the story a little different. It's, back in the days of Walter Cronkite, it was just, this happened this time, this night. And you're trying to figure out what's what. But now we have more opinions and talking heads. And so you might get a different perspective on an event or some background to an event and why it matters or what's important or what's highlighted. Come on in, guys. Sorry. No, I got to stay put. And so that's what we have, really. If you think about it in a simplified kind of version, that's what we have in Chronicles as compared to Kings. You're going to have it's not that the chronicler passes over every dark thing or shadows of the kings, because they'll talk about some of the evil things that some of the kings did, but they also shine up some of the kings' reigns. Like Solomon. Boy, Solomon comes out looking really good from the chronicler. There's not even a word of critique about anything that Solomon does. There's no mention of his multiple wives. There's no mention of him worshiping other gods. There's no mention of his wealth kind of corrupting him. None of that. It's all good, right? Of him giving a bad deal to King Hiram, Hiram of Tyre. Remember, we read in the books of Kings that the king of Tyre got him all the Lebanon cedar. He got him all the craftsmen. And in response, in Kings, it says, Solomon gave him 10 towns, and Hiram came to check him out. He's like, these are junk. And he named them garbage, basically. These are garbage. Kabul. This is trash. I do all this for you, and in your generosity, you give me trash. But none of that is mentioned in Chronicles. So some guys come out looking really nice. As we mentioned, in King David, there's no mention of Bathsheba. There's mention of Uriah, and there's mention of Bathsheba as a wife. There's no mention of how that came to be. There's no mention of Absalom or Amnon other than his sons. But no family history about David at all. And then I don't know if this struck you at all, but who built the temple? Solomon or David? What would you say after reading? Come on in, Jim.
Solomon. Yeah, but David really built
David.
yeah.
So
The building got built by Solomon, but all the stuff to
Plans
get
and
it built
materials,
was...
yeah.
So did that surprise you at all when you read Chronicles that Solomon built the temple, but David got all the trees, David got all the stone, David got all the craftsmen, David had the architectural blueprints for the temple. This is how you got to build it here. David got the ornaments for the table and the altar, everything, down to the minutest detail, the utensils the priests are going to use. So what basically, we call it Solomon's temple, but that's why I asked the question. Is it Solomon's temple or is it really David's temple? What do you think?
I thought they said that God didn't want David to build it, but David was going to have everything ready for it.
Correct. Because David, by his own admission and by the prophets, Nathan saying that he was too bloody,
Yeah.
right? But
I think David wanted to do it, but he wasn't allowed to. So he was pretty much doing every single thing he could.
Yeah, that he wasn't allowed to do.
Yeah.
Actually putting the pieces together.
Yeah.
No, but he knew he wasn't supposed to, so, okay, Solomon said, I'll get it all, so he doesn't have any excuses and he could get this done.
so let me ask you a little deeper question. Do you think, after what you've read both Kings, both Chronicles, do you think Solomon was invested in the temple in the way his dad was? and by extension, invested in his faith the way his dad was.
No.
I think he was in for the glory of it.
Right.
Aha.
It's for him, not for.
Yeah.
It's a good showpiece to the people. Look what a great king Solomon is. Maybe, yeah.
But
Well, it
that-
was given to him. I mean, it was there, it was ready for him. He didn't really have to do much. It was, you know.
He just
kinda-
had to follow the
inherited
plan.
it, basically, and then he just had to go through with, yeah. So I don't think he would have been as invested, because he didn't put all the blood, sweat, and tears into the planning.
Mm.
Maybe God wanted the family unit, you know, dad and his son to work together.
Well, and it is, God's promise to David is that his line, if they're faithful, are going to be the kings forever, which is a pretty powerful promise. And Solomon is on track to do that, and then it derails a little bit, and he loses sight of it. But yeah, any other thoughts or comments on this? Because
I guess maybe the reason God gave David was that he was too bloody. It just seems, I don't know, seems like there should be more to it than that. Because we're all kind of bloody. And David was more faithful than Solomon, right? And is it being bloody, or is it being faithful to be the one that builds the temple? You know?
Well, and let me ask you another question to follow up with that. So we have David, and we talked about this a study ago when we were talking about 2 Kings. And David, I asked you the difference between David and Solomon. And you said, well, David, somebody in our group said David seemed more merciful. And Solomon starts off with, killing Shimei and killing his brother and killing Joab, because it reads in the first part of 2 Kings 1 and 2 that before David dies, he tells them, hey, I let these guys have their peace, but you make sure they don't go down their grave in peace. Now my question is, as you've read this, Joab is David's first cousin. It's his sister's sister's son. And he's been with David this whole time. So is it possible that Solomon is using his dad as an excuse? Because who does Joab side with to be king?
The other son.
He sides with Adonijah, the oldest son. Joab throws in his hat with Adonijah, as does Abiathar, the priest. And so, what is more likely? That David actually wanted Joab dead, or that Solomon took care of everyone who was a threat? Maybe David told him that. It's possible. But I'm sure David didn't have as much to gain from it. Solomon had everything to gain from it. And David, as a father, might have been saying, hey, you're going to have to deal with this because this is a potential problem for you. But from what we're reading about David in the last part of his life, he's feeble. He's not all with it. He's not really running the kingdom.
Well, I thought it was interesting that he handed the throne off to his son while he was still alive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, basically he's not running the kingdom anywhere. He's in bed with the Shunammite woman, keeping him warm, whatever, and yeah, and again, we know, like Pastor Michelle brought this up last week, we know from the prophet Nathan what Nathan believed God to have said to him, that Solomon was to be the king. But that's the only place we have that, outside of the chronicler also establishing that, but he wasn't the next in line. He wasn't even the second or third or fourth in line. David had, we find out, 14 kids, and 11 of them in Hebron, and then he has some more, and he has some more later. But Solomon's way down the list. He's way down at the bottom of the caboose. So, some questions around some of that. But how many of you are into genealogy? How many of you have ever know anything about your family tree or history or roughly? All right, and anybody ever discover anything interesting or unique either through conversations with relatives or your search on, I don't know, Ancestry, or you did like a spit test and send it in or something? Anybody have any unique histories of your own genealogy? Yeah, Lynn.
I found out how my great-grandfather was killed in near Moody Bible Institute. He was strangled with this tie.
Wow. Okay, that's pretty horrible. But okay. Yeah, jeez. Anybody else have? Yeah, Kathy.
I didn't do the genealogy, but my cousin did, and she found out that my grandma, who, my gosh, she was the saint of our family, she was illegitimate. Wow.
Yeah, it's
I mean,
interesting you
nothing on
find
her,
out
but, no.
who was related and who really
Yeah.
wasn't.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But her parents did get married, so that makes it okay, I guess.
There you go. Okay.
Yeah, that was just funny to read that.
Anyone else? Yeah, Lisa.
I have, I think it was great-grandparents that were cousins that were married.
I have that as well. Brothers who married sisters. And then one brother who actually divorced one sister and married the other brother's wife. And a uncle who married the sister, not by blood now, of the man who killed President McKinley. She was a sister of her brother shot President McKinley. So.
I found out one side of my
Good.
family came over like the same time as the Pilgrims. So we've been here like forever.
There you go.
Yep.
All right.
With Lord Baltimore on his ship,
Well,
apparently.
all right. Fantastic. Well, so the first 9 chapters of First Chronicles, as you have guessed through your reading, are family trees. And there are some interesting things in there if you can wade through it. For example, last week, if you weren't here, I mentioned that as we're talking about Joab, Abishai, and I always forget the third brother's name, Ashael, the 3 sons of Zariah from Kings. And when you think of that, almost always when it reads sons of, it's their father that they're referencing. But without Chronicles, you would not know that Zariah is actually David's sister, not a man's name. It's his sister. And so they are his nephews, his first, so they're family. So it makes more sense, I think, when you read Kings, that he gives them, he tells them not to hurt his son Absalom. Joab kills him. He tells them not to do anything to turn over power to the general Asa and Abner, respectively. He kills them, Joab. And he continues to allow Joab to be his general back and forth, probably because he's family. It's tough to, how many of you have ever had business dealings with family? I mean, you feel like you gotta help them, and then, it can be tricky. So there's that going on in here. You hear about all these other kids that David has that you don't read about in the Kings. Some of them you do, some of them you don't. You read about Solomon's other brothers who are older than him. I believe there's a Shammua as well, and I always like that one because of SeaWorld, but anyway. And then, there's just a lot to wade through. Did you notice that one of the tribes has a very short family tree? In chapter 7, the tribe of Naphtali has 1 verse. And you're like, whew, thanks. Naphtali is easy. So why do you think that is? That all these other tribes of Israel have like scads and scads and scads down to like the 40th generation, and Naphtali's only got 1.
He was killed early and didn't have children. And maybe
You're close. You're sniffing around the right tree there. So
Hey, girls.
so we're talking about the 10 northern tribes, not Judah, not Benjamin. And it gets a little confusing because I just want to, let me pull back a bit. We have the 12 tribes of Israel, named after
12 sons of Jacob.
12 sons of Jacob. Kind of. Because there's a little bit of a switcheroo, right? Joseph is not one of the 12 tribes of Israel because we have Levi doesn't get any land. Just to keep it simple, they get no parcel of divine land as part of the promised land because they're going to be the priests and tend to the holy things of God. They do get cities in some of the other tribes, but for all effective purposes, they don't have a territory that is their own.
But that's one of the sons, right?
So Levi's one of the sons, the third son of Leah, who we'll hear about this Sunday. So Levi's out as far as one of the landowners that's divisible by tribe. So Joseph is also not counted. His sons are counted the blessing of Joseph. So we have the half tribe of Manasseh, and we have the tribe of Ephraim. All right, so Joseph's two sons fill in. Just think of it simply as this. Take Levi out, put the brick for half tribe of Manasseh in. Take Joseph out, put his son Ephraim in. And there you have the 12 tribes of Israel. Okay? With me so far? Yeah. All right. Then, why do we call it the half tribe of Manasseh? Well, when they're given land and they're crossing over into the land of Canaan, the land of promise, it's divided by the Jordan River. So Manasseh gets land on the east and west side of the Jordan. So they're half in east, half in west, the half tribe of Manasseh. Okay? That's why it's a half tribe. All right. Does it have any connection to the New Testament?
Well, Jesus had 12 disciples.
Yeah, that's not a made-up number, right? He picked 12. And he says they're going to sit on 12 thrones for the 12 tribes. So Jesus is the embodiment of God's promises to Jacob and Israel. So it's not random. It's not, they're connected.
Would it be considered a new?
Like a new form of the covenant?
Yes.
Yeah, they are the new embodiment of the old covenant. And it's not tied by land, but by faith.
Yes.
So that's that tie-in.
So when we get to this, I would think, but
Yeah, we will.
but so in Jesus' day when he was alive, were there still a prevalent 12 tribes of Israel?
Good question.
They're all gone, aren't they?
Good question.
Are
So
they kind of dispersed or?
So the southern tribes are all that remain, basically Judah.
Right.
When Assyria conquers, the half tribe of Manasseh and Ephraim and all those other tribes, they are deported. All the population is mixed.
Right.
And
Exile, they speak.
yeah, well, it's not so. So there's two big events. All right. We have Israel in the north and we have Judah in the south. Assyria comes in, conquers all the 10 tribes of the north and all that land, and displaces the people. Not just the rich, not just the leaders, but takes the poor and mixes them with other peoples. They move people around so that the power base is not strong. That's how Assyria kept their lands. It's confusing because Babylon and Assyria they're similar empires. Babylon ends up kind of swallowing Assyria and becoming the Babylonian Empire, the Babylonian-Assyrian Empire, and then finally just the Babylonian Empire. But it's the same territory primarily. And so in the days of Assyria, after they're conquering the north, they start to take some of Judah's towns in the south too. And remember, King Hezekiah is paying tribute, and Sennacherib comes and he says, I housed Hezekiah in Jerusalem like a bird in a cage. But he doesn't conquer Jerusalem. And Jerusalem doesn't end up being assimilated to the Assyrian Empire. So they remain. Benjamin and Judah remain. Okay? 10 tribes of the north are gone for all effects and purposes to some extent. Is every human being from Israel gone? No. There's still a remnant of people who are part of, they didn't get repopulated, right? So there's, let's say it's 20% of the population. But they're intermixing with all these other people, all these other customs. Judah says, this happened to you because you're not faithful like us to God. You twisted the faith, you worshiped the golden calves of Jeroboam, you didn't come down to Jerusalem, you didn't follow the Torah like we followed it, you kind of, for lack of a better word, bastardized the faith God gave us. And then the southerners had a name for them, Samaritans. You're the Samaritans. You live in Samaria. Your capital's in Samaria. So in Jesus' time, Samaritans, no thanks. All right? The southern tribes are Judah. They get conquered by Babylon. This is like 180 years after the northern tribes fall. So they hold on for a long time. The exile is the Babylonian specific. 70 years, they pull all the leaders out of Israel to Babylon. The poor people remain, but the Babylonian, the Israelite, the Judah leaders are in Babylon and struggling because, so you read a book like Daniel, which we'll get to. They took the young men and trained them to be servants to Babylonian royalty. So Daniel gets a new Babylonian name. You read about or hear about in Sunday school Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But those aren't their Hebrew names. Those aren't their birth names. Those are their Babylonian names.
Just to make it harder with the names.
So they have their, you think about it almost in terms of like when the settlers or missionaries, European missionaries, tried to Christianize Native Americans. And so you might have John Redfeather, who became, or Hawk Redfeather, who then becomes John Redfeather Williams, because they take on the Christian name. So it's the Babylonians wanted to give them a Babylonian identity, had to eat Babylonian food, and Daniel and his friends pushed back on that to some degree, and some degree they didn't. How do you live in those two worlds? All right, is that helpful? This kind of the timeline. So 721, 722, the northern tribes, this is BCE, they're gone, conquered. 586 BCE, Jerusalem falls and Judah is conquered. But then they go back, right? We read and if we read this, remember I talked about the Jewish or Hebrew order of the books of the Bible? If we read this, Chronicles would be the last book. And the last words are Cyrus, the king of Persia, sending the remnant back home to rebuild Jerusalem. And just before that is Ezra and Nehemiah, which talks about the plans and how they rebuild it. So at the end of the book is, they're coming home, which is kind of cool.
In Persia, you said?
Cyprus of Persia, yeah.
And how is that related to Babylon?
Babylon, so you got the Assyrians, they conquer. Then you have the Babylonians, they're the next kingdom to rise. Then you have the Persians.
To take over the Babylon?
Take over the Babylonians, yeah. Mm-hmm. And then you have the Romans. All right. Different kingdoms coming in different times.
So then does the Jewish faith end there with go back?
No.
And that's the end. What's the, as far as their books?
Uh-huh.
Because you said Chronicles is the end.
Of that,
technically.
That part of Scripture, yeah. So then you have, in the Catholic Bible we have the Apocrypha. We have 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th Maccabees. So those are Jewish texts about the resettlement families and trying to rebuild the kingdom of David's line of Judah. You have Tobit and Bel and the Dragon and Sirach. These are all writings, but they weren't considered scripture canon for the
Okay.
Jewish people.
So that's where it ends.
The Hebrew scripture, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, life changes dramatically when they return and the temple's destroyed and then they rebuild the temple. So this is all the first temple. Now during Jesus' time, you're going to have King Herod the Great. Just before Jesus and a peer of Jesus' infant life is Herod the Great. There's a lot of Herods. Herod the Great's the one you want to remember. He builds the second temple. And well, we'll talk about that in the New Testament. But it's really interesting because Herod, like King Solomon, he's not 100% Jewish. He's Hebrew or Israelite, half by one of his parents' side, and the other parent is from Edom. Of Esau, the people who didn't let the people go into the land, the people who fought with Israel during David's time, who conquered, who were paying tribute. So he is an Idumean, is the name of it, a person from Edom. And so he is, a lot of people don't like him as a king because he's not truly one of us. And so one of the things he does to try and say, see how Jewish I am, is to build the temple. If I serve the God that you all serve, so we're all in this together. So build all my projects.
Question, you said that the Hebrew scriptures stop with Chronicles, so Psalms,
And
Proverbs,
Ezra, and Nehemiah, and Chronicles are the last books. Yeah.
and Psalms, Proverbs, Isaiah.
They're in there. They come earlier.
Oh,
Yeah.
time-wise, okay.
Yeah. It's chronological.
Okay.
So whereas our books are ordered by subject,
Okay.
theirs is chronological. Yeah. All right. Back in the Chronicles. So if as you're reading this, I'm talking too much here. So I want to ask you all this question: how would you describe the different narrative from Kings, the Kings writers and Samuel writers, versus the writers of First and Second Chronicle? What are the two different or three different writers? What's their main reason for conveying the message they're conveying? And are they the same, or are they writing from a different point of view? And what would you say is the kind of the main thrust of each of the points of view as you've read them, or any distinction you make? You don't have to, you don't have to make this too tough. What distinction do you make between the two?
Well, I think the writer of Chronicles, the chronicler,
Yeah.
I think that he wants to end on a high note. He wants there to be hope for the future. Because when you get done reading Kings, it's just a bloody mess.
Yeah.
And I think that he wants to leave, the chronicler wants to have there be some sort of happy place or good feeling at the end, some hope.
Mm-hmm. Glass half full.
Yeah.
More optimistic than. I think you're right, Vicki. I think you're right. Why do you think that is? Versus, why is the writer of Kings or Samuel, why are they negative? Why are they not optimistic?
When was Kings written?
It's going to be after the fact of most of the kings of Israel. So probably during the time of Assyrian conquest, they're writing about the kings.
So still kind of in the thick of it, a little bit?
Yeah.
Well, that can be a reason, because you're right in the middle of it.
Yeah?
Suffering.
You don't want to pay for it. Yeah, that's a possibility.
If Chronicles is written by somebody some years after, maybe you can step back and you're not having the constant barrage of
Mm-hmm.
bad.
And we see that they're using Kings as a source, right? They say after
Yeah.
a lot of these reigns, you can read more in the annals of the kings of Israel.
Can be a little more objective.
Yeah.
When I hear the word chronicler, I think, well, it does kind of have almost a journalistic approach in a way,
Mm-hmm.
because it's reporting things a little more matter-of-factly, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
And like one of the chapters starts out with, in the spring of the year, the time when kings go out to battle. It's like, that's just the way it was. That's
Yeah.
perfectly accepted. And you could set your calendar to it every,
Sure.
like clockwork.
Now the writer of Kings says that as well, but the writer of Kings says David stayed off on the rooftop, snooping around,
Right.
whereas the chronicler drops all that narrative.
Right.
Yeah, yeah,
But it was written quite a few years after.
yes.
the King.
After Kings is all done and the ink's dry. Yeah,
There's
Some of it seemed the exact same words.
some of it is.
It's a little plagiarism.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Yeah,
that's what I was thinking, yeah.
same source.
Well, they cite the source.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So
Pam.
when it was written, they didn't realize they were gonna be the last book, right?
Oh boy, that's a good question. I don't know.
I was just thinking, if they did.
I think it's more that, like think about the New Testament, the church leaders gathered, in 365 in Constantinople, I think, or it might have been Nicaea. I think it's Constantinople, where they said, this is the order of the New Testament. These are the books that we're going to accept, and these other books we're not going to put in. So they canonized it. The Jewish canonization doesn't come until well after the exile. So your question's a great one. When did they decide that this is the last book of the canon? That's a great question. I wish Pastor Michelle was here to answer that one, because she'd probably know that better than me. But it's over a period of time.
So the
with
author
it.
didn't know.
No, the author didn't know. Yeah. The other thing that I wanted to not forget that Vicki said, you said hopeful, and you may not have saw it in different places in 2 Chronicles, but like with Hezekiah, and I'm going to just have you turn with me to find it here. With King Hezekiah and King Joash, but if you turn to 2 Chronicles, sorry. Gosh, where did I put it in my notes? The point is that he invites, when he has the Passover celebrated, they find the book of the law in the temple. The prophetess Huldah tells him what it means. I don't know if you picked up on that. There's a gate in Jerusalem named after the prophetess Huldah, Huldah's gate. It's also the eastern gate of Israel. It's the most important gate on the city wall of Jerusalem, because it's supposed to be the gate that the Messiah is going to come through. So it's really interesting that it also doubles as the name named after the prophetess who tells what the law means to the king. But my point is that, did you notice that Hezekiah invites the remains, whoever's left of Ephraim and Asher? These are all Israel tribes. And he invites them to come celebrate the Passover. He also sends invitations to all the other tribes of Israel. It's the first time we read about a king trying to not only celebrate the Passover, he's the second one to do it, but he also is trying to reunite the 12 tribes together in faith, which is really powerful. Because somebody, when we were just kind of sitting around saying, well, I think Hezekiah, it might have been Lisa, Hezekiah was the best king, maybe it was Rosemary. And here, his efforts to try and bring faith into the life, not only of Judah, but into Israel that had, been hundreds of years now on their own, is pretty impressive. It's pretty neat, but it's in the details there. It's hard to pick up on it unless you've read it a lot, because I know you're drowning in it.
They all said no, though, didn't they?
No, actually,
I thought it said that they didn't. That he was.
we
shut down.
read that some of them. It says just a few, but did I write this in my notes? If you go back, you'll see that there are a few from Ephraim and Asher and one other tribe that came.
Mine says, nevertheless, some men of Asher.
All right, and where is that, Pam?
30.
30.
Second Chronicles 30. Yeah, let's take a quick peek at that. So I think this is really pretty neat. Yeah, it says that in 30:10, after he sends out the couriers, many of them laughed and scorned and mocked them. And then verse 11, only a few from Asher, Manasseh, and Zebulun humbled themselves and came to Jerusalem. But he did have some success. I mean, there were some.
And then he prayed for them because they were coming and they weren't clean or whatever.
Yeah.
That was impressive.
Yeah, and they didn't, so they had been so far removed that they didn't know the customs, they didn't know to wash, how they were supposed to wash or how they were supposed to celebrate. And he prayed God, hey, basically, my language, not his, cut them some slack. They've been away for a long time, but they're back, they're trying. Just count their hearts. Punish them for this because they don't know any better. And God answers their prayer and says, yeah, they're here.
And it's going so good, they go for another 7 days.
Yeah, they keep going. They keep going, yeah. Yeah, so what other things struck you from the reading that maybe you made notes on or that jumped out at you as you're reading these? Outside of I know I've heard from some of you how hard it was to read the first 9. But after that, what are some things that stuck out to you that surprised you or that you learned? Maybe some additional details from Kings that reshape the story?
So I've got something that is not mathematically logical to me.
Yes,
and that-
yes.
So, 2 Chronicles 34, Josiah was 8 years old when he became king,
Mm-hmm.
and he was the son of David.
No. Josiah is the son of Manasseh,
I'm reading it
I
right
believe.
here. Twice.
Where,
Didn't they sometimes say, though, like, son of whoever, or like your father,
he's,
David,
Oh.
kind of say it, like, as
Just
an
because
overall?
he's from his line.
Yeah.
so
Maybe, but it says it in 3 also. No, it just says it in
in chapter
Yeah.
3
no,
or
in verse 3.
34:3? Mine reads ancestor of David.
Okay, mine says, yeah.
Yours says son
Mine
of
says
David?
Yeah.
Mine says his father David.
So think about it in this way, like with that expression, and we're going to get this in the New Testament in a couple different ways. Remember when Jesus, we're talking about Palm Sunday, and Jesus comes in and they say, Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, the Son of David. So it's a title, but they'll also, and Jesus will call himself the Son of Man. Jesus isn't the only person who has either of those titles. We'll see that the prophets, like Elijah, Son of Man, Elisha, Son of Man. So it's a title, but not necessarily like he's the actual son of Adam, other than he's a human being, or the actual son of David. He is in that line. Yeah, it gets confusing.
I kind of thought that, but when it said it the second time, I thought,
Yeah.
And I caught that too, and I'm thinking, so what did David, he had Solomon right after him, and then years later, all of a sudden, this guy pops up, and then he becomes the king too, so, yeah.
Mine says son of
Yeah.
King Aman.
He is literally the son of King Aman.
Okay.
He is his dad. Yeah.
interesting.
Bad King Anam. Yeah. Yeah, we have some, but there are some places where there's some distinct differences. I pointed out the census taking that David takes, and God incited it in 2 Samuel to punish Israel for their waywardness and for basically having kings, because God wanted to be the leader of Israel and not the kings. And in Chronicles, it says Satan incited David to do this. We also have when David dances before the ark, you have Saul's daughter Michal, who in Kings, why is she upset in Kings that he's dancing? She says, well, his loincloth is lifted, and he's exposing himself to all the maidens of Israel. A, that's not proper for a king. B, she's potentially jealous, or as a wife, thanks for doing this because I'm your wife and you're, And his response is, I dance naked in front of whoever I got to dance in front of, all the maids. Yeah, thanks, David. But here in Chronicles, it says that he's unbecoming the office of a king. And the linkage to what she understands a king should be from her father Saul, and that David is not acting like she thinks her daddy would have acted. So it's a different, one is like a jaded wife, the other one is, you're not behaving like a king. I know how a king should behave because my father was king. And so it's this division between her being Saul's daughter and David's not living up to what she thinks are the expectations. It's a different perspective of why Michal and David have a falling out. So which one is closer to the actual reason? I mean, we can't ask Michal and David, but these writers had two different thoughts about it.
Could be all of the above.
It could be both. It could be both. It could be both. It very well could be both. Other things that stood out to you in these texts? Other kings, other stories that spoke to you?
I don't know, why is it so hard to be good? It's just like, they all start out, or a lot of them at least start out, being so good. And it's almost because it's hard to be perfect. It's
a high standard for the king,
it's
right?
A really high standard.
Yeah.
You've been really good, but then there's a little pride, and I'm like, oh Lord, that's really hard.
Right. Yeah. And these are all the tribes of Judah, the kings of Judah, rather. We're not talking about the kings of Israel, other than a mention of how the kings of Judah are connected to them. Like they're all gone, and the chronicler, this is the nation of Judah that we're concerned about in Chronicles, not the nation of Israel. Did you pick up on that too? We're not talking about Jeroboam and Omri and Ahab, other than to mention they existed, but nothing about their reigns. They're just bad. They're all bad. According to Chronicler, they're all bad.
I still struggle with some of the stuff, like, the guy that went and, to rescue the ark.
Uzzah, yeah.
Yes, okay. So there was, he with what I'm thinking that, oh my gosh, it's going to fall trying to grab it. Mm-hmm. And then you have that horrible king that was sacrificing his children at the end. Mm-hmm. And then he repents at the end and he's forgiven. And I'm just like juxtaposed those two things. It's like, it seems, I don't want to say arbitrary, but it just seems like, how is one person who's doing something to be respectful and helpful and whatever, and then this other person, I still struggle with a lot of that.
Sure, absolutely. I would just, and this may or may not be helpful, but try and look at it, if possible, that what matters to the chronicler is the king, describing the reign of the king. Uzzah's death is a judgment on David, and the chronicler tells us in more depth than kings ever did or Samuel ever did, because David didn't follow the law of the Torah, that the Levites had to carry it, that the poles had to be a specific way. And David just did his own thing. And so Uzzah, even though he's trying to be helpful, and even though he's a pawn in, a Mongol pawn in the game of life, he's a pawn in David's plans, his death is a judgment on David's lack of fidelity to the law. So it's David that he's blaming. But yeah, Uzzah dies. Terrible. It's terrible. I always feel bad for Uzzah. I agree. I feel bad for Uzzah. He's just trying to, he doesn't know. Where was Hezekiah to say, this guy doesn't know? He's just trying to help. But it's a judgment against David. That is what the writers are trying to say. Yeah.
And David does get mad at God about that.
He does.
In the Chronicles.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't help Uzzah that David's upset, but
then what about all the other, taking the census, and then, God kills 75,000 people who didn't call it the census. Same thing.
Again, on David, and David says, it's my fault. The punishment is on David, but other people are dying because of you. Yeah.
And he picks from the three options, and that's the one that
Plague.
Yeah, but interesting, so the warning from Torah is if you take a census without God's approval, a pestilence will happen. So did David pick it, or is this by default what's going to happen, or what's, yeah. All right, yeah, I can't, there's no way to soften that there, Uzzah is in the crosshairs.
From Uzzah. I feel bad.
Yeah,
Because I would have been Uzzah. I'd been like, whoops.
I feel bad for Uzzah too. You wonder if it had been different if Jesus was there. I don't know. It's, is it that God was so angry with Uzzah, or Uzzah dies and David is blamed because I don't know. God didn't punish the others. I don't know. That's between Uzzah and God. I don't know what's going on in Uzzah's heart, but Uzzah's dead, and this is the way that they're making sense of it.
Maybe he just had a heart attack, and that's how the Chronicles
Well,
thought.
Yeah. Everything is connected to God, right? So you're going to explain it because of faith. It's either a curse or it's a blessing. So if it's a bad thing, they did something to bring about God's wrath. And if it's something that's blessed, it's because God is blessing them. God is God. So that's how the writer, remember from Deuteronomy, if you obey the law, you'll be blessed. If you mess it up, you're going to get cursed. That's what we're operating under, blessings and curses, blessings and curses. That's not always going to be what we're operating under as we get into the New Testament. That's going to shift. But for now, that's what these writers are operating on. Other stories or any other kings that jump out at you? We read good things about Josiah, and then he also has some shortcomings. Uzziah starts off to be a good king. He has another name in the Kings, so that's a little confusing. You read about Uzziah who tries to sacrifice on the altar instead of the priests in 2 Chronicles. Where's that at? Before or after Hezekiah? I think he's. Sorry. If it makes you feel any better, I don't remember all the order of all of them either. Uzziah, king, brave Uzziah. Chapter 26 of 2 Chronicles. So in the books of Kings, Uzziah is not his name. It is Azariah in 2 Kings. Same person, different name. How would you ever follow that unless you knew it?
Spell Azariah?
Azariah.
His father is Amaziah.
It's really tough to follow. The thing about King Joash, one last one, is we read about Jehoiada, the priest who raises this young king, and he's a reformer. Things are going great. Then the priest dies. And without his kind of truth teller, Joash gets into all kinds of trouble and turns into a really nasty guy, actually, and then kills one of the prophets of God and is assassinated because he just, without his mentor, becomes just a bad mamma jamba. So, other thoughts, other questions, other closing statements about 1st and 2nd Chronicles?
I guess maybe the amount of not only the detail of the shrine or the temple, but how much gold and silver and how much wealth went into it.
Yeah.
That surprised me, because if you then go fast forward into the days where all the merchants and the money changers were in the temple and Jesus came in and threw the tables around and stuff, it just kind of surprised me that there was that much gold and silver and wealth that went into the temple with all the suffering and all. You would have thought that those monies that could have been spent somewhere else. Why would God want that much of riches in the temple. It just didn't seem kosher, to me.
That's a great question.
Yeah.
Why is there so much gold and silver in the temple? And the other side of that is, I mean, you think about the cathedrals in Europe.
That's what I was gonna say.
What about the Vatican?
Yeah,
I was
yeah.
gonna say that, yeah.
So on the one hand, you might say it's an expression of giving our best, our most precious to God, because God is the highest honor.
Right.
But on the other hand, does God value the same things as precious that we do? And so maybe that's the conflict or struggle. When you read a book like Revelation in the New Testament, it says you'll hear people make expressions like, in heaven the streets are gold, and the walls of the city are all these precious gems. A lot of people say, oh, that's because heaven is so wealthy or rich or powerful. And I would say, well, that's one way of looking at it, but I kind of look at it this way as a former street paver. Stuff that you walk on, that's everyday use, the stuff we value most highly, most precious, gotta have it, is trod upon by feet in heaven. It's just, it's lower than anything else, because it might matter so much to us. We might fight over it, be greedy over it, but to God, it's pretty, but it's not the point of life or wisdom or God. So, all right. Well, gang, you've gotten through, I think, the most challenging book of the Hebrew Bible books. And next, we are going to, chronologically, it's going to be a little confusing. So just listen for 1 second here. Think about, all right, we've just finished the Kings. The people in between this book and the next book, 2 books we're reading, have been airlifted or taken to Babylon, rings in their noses, and they've been carted off as slaves. The leaders of Israel have. So time period of like the books of Daniel and Esther. And they're in exile, longing for home, remembering the temple. It's destroyed, it's gone. The walls of Jerusalem are gone. Only the poor people remain. So the next 2 books, in 2 weeks' time, because you need a 2-week break, Ezra and Nehemiah are going to be about the rebuild effort. So you're going to have the governor, the politician, Nehemiah, and you're going to have the priest, Ezra. From their 2 perspectives, what it's like to go back and what they have to do to rebuild the people and the land. They're going to have some people who are already there. Some of them who are Jewish, some of whom are resettled peoples from other lands, who are going to oppose their rebuild plans. And then they're going to have some conflict with moving back in, people who have moved in while they've been away, and who's running this show. Because I got a letter from the king of Persia. Well, I don't care. I wrote to the king of Persia, and he said I'm fine where I'm at. So, same kind of thing Israel's dealing with today. This is my land. No, it was my land first. It was their land first. That's going to all get started here. All right, as we read Ezra and Nehemiah. There's going to be some tough stuff in there too. You read the book of Ruth. There's going to be conflict from the priests. Can you intermarry foreign women? Can you have interfaith or inter-ethnic marriages? Ruth says yes, as long as you're converted to a follower of God. Ezra says, Doesn't matter if you're worshiping Yahweh or not. Doesn't matter if you're married 30 years. Get those foreign people out of here. And you're going to see that in Ezra. Okay? Fun stuff to talk about. Because certainly we have some of those issues. August 16. I want to say we're skipping the 2nd and the 9th. to give you a 2 weeks reprieve from reading Chronicles.
Three
And
weeks.
then we're jumping into Ezra and Nehemiah.
We'll be back in 3 weeks.
Third week, back here, same time, same Sabbath.
And 2 books.
2 books again. So you get 2 weeks off, but you have 2 books. They're combined. They're as long as Second Chronicles. They're not real long. I think Ezra's 9 chapters and Nehemiah I think 16. Ezra and Nehemiah. So they're going to be next in your Bibles, but chronologically, no. In between there, you're going to have like Daniel and Lamentations, which is about the conquest. Some of the Psalms, all that stuff happens
They
before
kind of
these.
fast forward. Ezra.
They fast forward, yeah. They're in our Bibles by subject, not by chronology. So here we're going to get a little confusing. So every time we do one of the prophets or one of the books of wisdom, I'll try to tell you chronologically, here's where this piece fits in.
So this is before
How are we
Chronicles,
doing
though.
Psalms?
That's a great question.
In a week.
Ideally,
So start now.
ideally, what I think is we would split Psalms into maybe three weeks or a couple of sections where we talk about. I would have you read. I got to talk to Pastor Michelle about this too, but I had you read a section of Psalms, and we'll talk about one type of psalm from that section, because there's different. There's psalms of lament. There's songs of praise. There's songs against our enemies. Songs of righteousness, and so they're intermixed through the psalm book. So they're not all like all the songs of lament are in this
Couldn't
section.
do that
No.
by subject, huh?
Yeah, no, it's not by subject. So what we'll do is we'll read through them. You get a flavor for them each week, but we'll cover 1 or 2 types of psalms, over the course of a couple weeks. Because otherwise it would be just too much to take in. All right?